In June of 1950, the world was still nursing a collective hangover from its last global brawl. Everyone had agreed that another world war was a monumentally bad idea, which is why it was so inconvenient when North Korea decided to invade South Korea on June 25th. This wasn't some spontaneous uprising. Kim Il-sung had spent months asking Joseph Stalin for permission, like a teenager wanting to borrow the car. Stalin, ever the helpful puppet master, finally gave the green light, mostly because he thought the Americans wouldn't bother showing up. And to be fair, the U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, had recently given a speech where he conveniently left South Korea out of America's defensive perimeter in Asia. It was the geopolitical equivalent of putting a free-to-a-good-home sign on your neighbor's lawn. So, 90,000 North Korean troops, backed by Soviet T-34 tanks, rolled south expecting a quick, clean victory. They were about to learn a valuable lesson about America's talent for showing up to parties it wasn't explicitly invited to. It was a classic case of everyone reading the room completely, utterly wrong. President Truman's administration had a branding problem. Calling this a war was politically messy and sounded suspiciously like World War III. So they settled on a much friendlier term, a police action. Because nothing says keeping the peace like carpet bombing and amphibious assaults. The United Nations, in a moment of rare decisiveness, helped by the Soviets boycotting the Security Council over a seating dispute, a truly masterful own goal, voted to intervene. Suddenly, this police action had a global posse. The first American troops rushed over from Japan were so unprepared they were dubbed Task Force Smith. They were under-equipped, out of shape, and promptly got flattened by North Korean tanks. A great start. This necessitated a slightly more dramatic plan. Enter General Douglas MacArthur and his idea for a landing at Incheon. Military planners called it suicidal, citing massive tides, fortified positions, and a narrow channel. MacArthur, who never let reality interfere with a good story, did it anyway. And it worked spectacularly, proving that sometimes the line between genius and insanity is just a successful outcome. With the Incheon landing, the entire war flipped on its head. The North Korean army, which had been pressing south, suddenly found its supply lines cut and a massive UN force at its back. They collapsed. Seoul was recaptured. Everything was going swimmingly. Too swimmingly. MacArthur, riding a wave of victory and his own colossal ego, saw an opportunity. The original mission was just to restore the border at the 38th parallel. But why stop there? Why not, unify all of Korea under a friendly government? This is called mission creep, and it's the strategic equivalent of going to the store for milk and coming home with a boat. Warnings started trickling in from China, whose new communist government was getting a little twitchy about American troops approaching its border at the Yalu River. China's premier Zhou Enlai sent messages through the Indian ambassador, basically saying, "Please don't come any closer." MacArthur dismissed these warnings as Oriental bluffing. He assured Truman the war would be over by Christmas. You can almost hear the universe laughing. It's the kind of overconfidence you only see in Greek tragedies and people who are about to get hit by a train. So, UN forces pushed north towards the Yalu River, full of Thanksgiving turkey and victory cheer. On the other side of that river, however, roughly 300,000 Chinese soldiers, part of the People's Volunteer Army, had been secretly crossing into North Korea for weeks. They weren't volunteers, and they weren't just there to help. They were there to deliver a message. They moved at night, stayed hidden during the day, and had no air support. Their main piece of military technology was the bugle. And on November 25, 1950, they used those bugles to signal a massive, terrifying assault on the scattered UN forces. The result was one of the longest retreats in American military history. At the Chosin Reservoir, a division of U.S. Marines found themselves surrounded by 10 times their number, in temperatures that hit minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Their rifles froze, their food rations turned into rocks, and their escape route was a narrow mountain road the Chinese kept blowing up. They famously fought their way out, but MacArthur's Christmas offensive had turned into a desperate fight for survival. So much for a quick police action. The shock of the Chinese intervention sent MacArthur into a bit of a tailspin. His solution was simple, elegant, and completely insane. He wanted to expand the war into China. He proposed a naval blockade, bombing industrial centers, and this was his masterstroke, dropping 30 to 50 atomic bombs on Manchuria to create an impassable radioactive wasteland. Because when your house has termites, the logical solution is to burn down the entire neighborhood. President Truman, back in Washington, had a slightly different perspective. He was trying to avoid starting World War III with both China and its buddy, the Soviet Union. This disagreement wasn't kept quiet. MacArthur started writing letters to congressmen and giving press statements, openly criticizing the administration's policy of a limited war. He was basically subtweeting the President of the United States while commanding an active war. Truman, realizing you can't have a general running his own foreign policy, made a choice. On April 11, 1951, he fired Douglas MacArthur, a five-star general and a national hero. MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome and gave a famous speech to Congress. But the point was made. Even gods have to answer to the guy in the Oval Office. With MacArthur gone and both sides having tested the limits of what they could achieve, the war entered its most pointless phase. The front line stabilized almost exactly where the war had started, around the 38th parallel. What followed was 2 years of brutal trench warfare, disturbingly similar to World War I, but with better jets. The conflict evolved into a series of bloody, repetitive battles for strategically meaningless pieces of real estate. Places with names like Pork Chop Hill, Heartbreak Ridge, and the Punch Bowl became infamous. Armies would spend thousands of lives and tons of artillery shells to capture a hill, only to abandon it a week later or lose it in a counterattack. While this was happening on the ground, diplomats were sitting in a tent in a place called Panmunjom, arguing. The peace talks started in July 1951, but the war wouldn't end until July 1953. For 2 solid years, men were dying in droves over hills nobody really wanted, while negotiators argued over the shape of the negotiating table. It was the definition of tragic absurdity. So, what were the diplomats arguing about for 2 years while the meat grinder kept running? The main sticking point was surprisingly human: prisoners of war. The UN held over 130,000 Chinese and North Korean prisoners. Standard procedure is you send everyone home. Simple. Except a huge number of these prisoners really did not want to go home. Many of the Chinese volunteers were ex-nationalist soldiers who had been forced into the Communist Army, and they preferred to go to Taiwan. The North Koreans had their own reasons for not wanting a return ticket to Kim Il-sung's paradise. The U.S. and its allies argued for voluntary repatriation. Let the prisoners choose. This was a great moral and propaganda victory. The communists insisted on forcible repatriation. Everyone goes back, no questions asked. Admitting their soldiers didn't want to come home was unthinkable. So for 2 years, the war continued, adding another 100,000 casualties to the total, all because of a deadlock over the fate of men who had already been captured. The principle was noble. The cost was staggering. It was a hell of a price to pay for a philosophical argument. Eventually, something had to give. Joseph Stalin conveniently died in March 1953, which took some of the pressure off the communist side to look tough. The new Eisenhower administration in the US also started making not-so-subtle threats about using nuclear weapons if the stalemate didn't end. Suddenly, compromise looked a lot more appealing. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was finally signed. It wasn't a peace treaty, it was a ceasefire, a really, really long time out. It established a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, a 2.5-mile wide strip of land that, ironically, became one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth. So, after 3 years of fighting, roughly 3 million casualties, and entire countries laid to waste, where did everyone end up? Right back where they started, at the 38th parallel. All that effort, all that bloodshed, all that political maneuvering to achieve the status quo. It was sold as a victory for containing communism, but for the people who fought it, it felt like history's most violent and inconclusive draw. The Korean War's legacy is a strange one, mostly because people in the West immediately tried to forget it, sandwiching it between the good war and the televised disaster of Vietnam. But it changed everything. North Korea, sealed off from the world, calcified into the bizarre totalitarian state it is today, a living fossil of Stalinism. South Korea, after a few decades of dictatorship, miraculously transformed into a vibrant democracy and economic powerhouse. For the United States, it solidified the Cold War mindset. It justified a massive, permanent military budget and set the precedent for fighting limited wars all over the globe, which went just great later on. It was the first hot war of the Cold War, a brutal testing ground for ideologies, where the main victims were the Korean people themselves. It proved that you could have a conflict with millions of casualties involving global superpowers and still not call it a real war. It was a limited conflict, but only on paper. The graves were just as deep. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!